Hello, and welcome to Lens, the podcast brought to you by British Screen Forum. My name is Jon Gisby, and I'm delighted that you're listening. Welcome to this episode of Lens, brought to you by the British Screen Forum. In this first series, we're focused on public service broadcasting, the UK's long-held policy framework that aims to ensure that everyone in the UK can access TV and radio programmes that inform and educate as well as entertain. So far, we've heard the perspectives from inside two of our broadcasters via conversations with Mark Thompson, who was Director General at the BBC, and David Abraham, who was CEO at Channel 4. We've also heard from inside government, from John Whittingdale and James Connell, two recent Secretaries of State. In today's conversation, we combine both of those perspectives and add a third through a conversation with Ed Richards, who held senior roles at the BBC and in Number 10, and then at Ofcom, the converged regulator that he helped to create. So delighted today to be joined in conversation by Ed Richards, managing partner and co-founder of Flint Global. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you, John.
In current life, Flint Global advises clients who face regulatory challenges and assists in navigating them. So a number of these conversations, these conversations typically start with you have a particularly unique vantage point across all of the things, having been at the heart of the BBC, been one of the instrumental creators of Ofcom and then led Ofcom, really kind of setting up and managing the framework within PSBs operate. The other is amongst several other things. You were once described by Lord Grade as brilliantly intelligent, scrupulously fair, very open and challenging. So on every level, really looking forward to the conversation. We'll start with the easy one. What is public service broadcasting and why does it matter?
Well, the way I would answer that is by avoiding what I think has often happened in the past in these conversations, which is that the easy route to take and answer that question, which is to reel off a series of adjectives, superlatives, and other types of words which are designed to make people feel very, very excited. In other words, you talk about diversity, creativity, innovation, originality, storytelling, and all of this sort of thing. And I will come back to those, but I don't think it's the right place to start. And the reason I don't think it's the right place to start is because I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that purely commercial, private provision, market-based content creation provides an awful lot of that, and it's absurd to argue that it doesn't. So the real question about public service broadcasting, PSB, is not can you reel off all those words? It's why are you doing something in addition to that which would happen anyway, and what is it? And I think the answer to that is to say, well, there's a range of things that we want for the wider good of society, for citizenship, there to be a very good supply of, and a bigger supply of than we might suppose that the market would otherwise provide. And those things are, of course, concerned with content that supports our democratic process, that provides information to the citizenship of the country, that is in an entertaining way educational, which is referenced in the culture and history and context of our country rather than being some global product or service which could be made anywhere. And those are the sort of key features of it. And the key defining purpose for me is that this is an area, because of the wider benefits they have in those areas, that you want to make sure that there is a bigger supply of content of that kind than the market alone would provide. And that for me is the test. That is the heart of what it's about. And those are both the sort of characteristics of public service broadcasting and the reason that you're trying to invest in it.
From a policy point of view, it might go back to your days in number 10, and you're sitting in the signal box with all the public policy levers in front of you. What is from a kind of government and policy intervention point of view? What's it for? What is it aiming to deliver?
It's aiming to deliver, a very healthy supply, a widespread availability of, and sufficiently high, ideally very high take up and use of the kind of content which has those wider benefits. So, making sure the population and your citizenry is as informed about what matters in society in relation to the democratic process as possible, making sure that there is content, cultural work, output that is about the country in which we live and how it's changing. So that is actually I said I'd get back to these words, that is about telling stories and thinking about and responding to our current society and indeed our history. And it's about the creative response to the kinds of challenges that we face. But you could simplify that in and around educate, inform, and entertain if you want to as well. You can come back to that. I mean, I don't want to try and overcomplicate it. I should add one thing at this point, though. So for me, though, that's the heart of the argument. It's about making sure the system overall, with its private provision, its purely commercial provision, and its mix of public service provision, provides a really healthy and diverse range of output of that kind, which is very, very widely available to people, and more so than would be the case if you didn't have the public service intervention. Now, you're going to say, or somebody could say, yeah, but how can you measure that, and so on and so forth? And you can't measure it absolutely precisely and scientifically. You're looking for an estimation, which is contrasting two states of the world. One state of the world is where you would have some of that provision provided through pure market forces, and you want to achieve a state of world where there is plenty more of it, which increases the diversity of it, the range of it, the impact of it, the reach of it, and so on. And those are the two states of the world you're trying to contrast, in my mind. I would add one other factor, which I will no doubt come on to, but which to me has always been a secondary objective, but it is an objective, which is that I think if you achieve a positive outcome in relation to that set of objectives, you should get quite a significant set of spillover benefits in relation to what you'd call the creative economy. So you are likely to get, I hesitate to use the phrase industrial strategy, so let's not use it, but I think it's clear that you should get some very positive economic spillovers that are of wider benefit as well, and they're significant and I think valuable to the UK.
I suspect that many commentators have said that the kind of thoughtful interventions along the way around the degree to which the broadcasters are making their own content versus the Channel 4 publisher model and all the rest of it, and the way that has all been calibrated over time has been one of the things that has catalysed the creative economy that we now have. And again, one of the reasons that we're getting so much inward investment. Universality, you've talked a lot about availability, and supply and having content available. To what extent, in order to get the public policy benefits, to what extent do you also need to try and find a way that it is actually consumed?
Yeah, I think two things are important on that, and I think they go in lockstep with my view of what the reason you have a public service broadcasting system or set of interventions. And what one is definitely universality, because I struggle, if your aim is to increase the supply of and the impact of and the take-up of and the reach of that type of service in our cultural and content context, then I think for it not to be universal would seem slightly perverse. So I think universality is very much consistent with what I see as the primary set of goals, and by extension, ease of access and availability is important as well, because reach and impact of these interventions is obviously important. I mean, let me put it in the negative. If you've got a series of interventions which either have direct or indirect costs for the taxpayer, or through foregone auction revenues, for example, however you want to think about it, if it has direct or indirect costs of some kind, then if it turns out that those interventions have got zero reach and zero impact, then I don't see how you can possibly justify them. So they've got to have reach and impact, and therefore, it seems to me to follow that you need to think also about not only universality as a starting point, but also about availability and access, and that is about responding to the distribution challenges of the age.
In the conversations we've had so far, there's sort of two sort of underlying models, almost sort of intellectual models, if you like, that come up. To paraphrase a conversation we had with Lord Putnam, if we can make a case for the National Health Service being about physical health, then essentially this is about cultural and intellectual and mental health, and therefore the range of content and the scale of the intervention should be quite significant. Conversation with John Whittingdale, much more a kind of classic market failure argument, which is that as the market continues to provide, and as actually consumers have a wealth of choice to stuff, does it still need to be funded through public service intervention in some way? And genres drop out of that: news, current affairs, kids, maybe one or two others, but actually entertainment and drama look as though they're being provided pretty well by the market, and people can buy them if they want them, so why do they need to be universally available for free at taxpayer expense? Are those two models, I mean, given the span that you have over the debate as it's unfolded, are those two models the right ones? And how have they shifted over time? Do they shift along with the sort of political zeitgeist of the day, or is there other things going on?
Well, they definitely do shift along with the political zeitgeist of the day, but I would encourage people to try and avoid letting them be shifted along with the zeitgeist of the day. I mean, they are absolutely two poles of the debate. But again, I would try and take it a level below or above, beyond that, however you want to think about it. I'd add a set of thoughts to it, and they would be roughly as follows. I mean, firstly, there is always the problem of what is a market failure and what is not a market failure, and you can take a very narrow or quite a broad view on that. I mean, if you take a narrow view, you could, for example, easily say, well, I was watching the news channels last night, and it was very clear there are plenty of 24-hour news channels. There's no shortage of news provision. There's quite a lot. But the question is whether that gives you the mix that is optimizing, the best for the UK with its needs, and how we think about that. And the answer is that we think actually we should have public service intervention there to increase the supply of and the diversity of the range of news provision, and that I think would be widely regarded as sensible. There's other genres where you could say, and you mentioned entertainment, you mentioned drama. There's other genres. You can always ask the question. To my mind, I've always felt that there's a very narrow market failure approach you can take, and you could take that, but I've always preferred a slightly more accommodating one, which recognises the sort of positive externalities argument. So the spillover benefits, rather than just does the market provide it or not, and if it does, then that you just stop there. I think this is why I referred to the sort of quantity of supply. I think in some of these areas you just want to make sure there's very good diverse supply, because that's probably where the best outcome lies. So the fact that the market is providing some of it doesn't necessarily lead me to conclude that therefore you don't need a public service broadcasting addition or intervention. So that's one issue. I think the second issue that you have to think about is the relationship between the economic perspective that, in a sense, those two poles provide. It is a kind of market failure outlook, but you need to connect that to your understanding of institutions and how institutions function in these sorts of markets. And in that space, in that area, that to me really is a very important dimension to this. And one of the reasons I think, by and large, you can say we've had a very good system is because we've had a diversity of institutions. And on the one hand, you've got purely commercial companies, totally, regulated at a very general level, but no more. Certainly no content obligations. And they have sometimes produced some outstanding content, which you'd look at and say, crikey, that's got fantastic public service dimensions. And you can think of things like, Sky Arts or, drama of various different kinds, all sorts of things. But you'd also look across and you'd say, well, in the end, those providers are actually just profit maximizing, and that's fine. That's what they're supposed to do in a regulated context. But then you look across and you go through the public service broadcasters that are purely privately held. You go through Channel 4, which is currently publicly owned, right across to the BBC. And I think one of the strengths has been that diversity, because you've got a range of institutions thinking about how they produce content in different contexts. And again, difficult to be scientific about it, but I think that's had very positive. That mix has had a very, very overall positive benefits, largely because it gives you this diversity of supply. And I see a lot of markets where diversity of supply is a very attractive feature. So I would also say you've just got to connect that those two alternatives that you described back into not just your view of the nature of public service broadcasting and, for want of a better phrase, your view of market failures and the market contribution and how you think about that either narrowly or broadly. And I err towards thinking about it broadly. And then you've also got to think about it in the context of how institutions function in markets. And by institutions, I mean, everything ranging from companies to public corporations through to something like the BBC.
One of the things that characterized your tenure at Ofcom was particularly reviewing the kind of scale and scope of the public service remits, particularly of ITV, and really trying to square the circle of the economic conditions they were in, which were partly transitory in the particular economic crisis at the time, but also recognizing the shift away from linear and ad-funded content, and how that still fits with a PSB remit. You stated very clearly at the time that the ownership matters, and the degree to which something is in the organisation's public core purpose around PSB provision. Those organisations are going to function differently than than an organisation that is commercially functioning with a shareholder remit. Can you say a little more about that, and particularly as we head into a world in which potentially Channel 4 goes into privatisation, the kind of pros and cons of doing things via a regulated remit with commercial incentives?
Yeah, I think it's an uncontroversial view, really. I think all I'm saying there, and all I've ever said on it, is that the purposes of an organisation are likely to affect, matter in relation to the decisions it takes. And if you just think about the range of different ways that organisations are set up, ranging from charities through to social enterprises, social impact companies, through to the more pure Milton Friedman-esque model of companies, and at the other end, I think it is sort of self-evidently true. And anybody on a board of one of those entities, asks themselves, what are we here to do? What's our purpose? And as soon as you ask that question, then it's going to affect your judgment about how you prioritize resource, what kinds of decisions you make in particular situations, and so on. So I think it's an incredibly uncontroversial thing to say in most respects. I guess the rubber hits the road when you ask yourself, well, in a particular case, does it make any difference? And you then got to think about it specifically. And it's I don't think the answer is it doesn't make any difference, because I don't think that really can hold. I mean, if you change the primary function or ownership or purpose of something, I think it's obviously likely to change it. I think that is rarely going to be the main issue. The main issue is is it a trade-off between that and something else? I mean, the argument being made on Channel 4 is that it will be better able to do certain other things if it was privately held. So it's not about does it, or it's more about what are the range of choices in which ownership is a factor, and maybe a benefit in certain regards, but some people may regard it as a problem in other regards. So in some ways, I think my view that institutional or organizational purpose and motive matters is, I do think that's pretty uncontroversial, because I think it obviously is. It obviously is going to have an effect. If you flipped Tesla tomorrow and made it a charity, then it would have an effect, right? So I don't think that's controversial. I think it becomes more difficult when people say, well, what matters for the effectiveness of this organization in the long run, and what role does the particular ownership status play in that?
As the regulator in the middle of that, you're clearly then trying to calibrate the remit that is that the individual company is expected to deliver, based on the economics, the underlying economics of its business model and what the prospects of that are, and the degree to which you then hold them to account to continue to do stuff that they wouldn't necessarily do if they were purely driven by market forces. When you look back, it's probably a rhetorical question, but do you think you got the balance right?
You invited me to say yes, I got that right. In all respects, I think I'm not going to do that. Let me just give you a couple of examples. I think let's take ITV.
Let me give you a specific piece of kind of analysis in a way.
Sure.
Some people have looked back at the change in the ITV remit and said, has the dividend that has been delivered to shareholders since then actually been greater, and should some of that still have been kept within the remit? I guess that's the core of the question.
Well, that is a difficult. I mean, that is almost an empirical question that I don't know the answer to, and I doubt anybody. I mean, it's quite a complicated piece of empirical work, but let me try and answer it directly in a different way. I think if I look back on the ITV question, there is a careful judgment to be made here in relation to you want to. We felt it was very important to keep ITV as a healthy, vibrant part of the PSB family, and there were those who argued that to do that, you just sort of stayed exactly where you were, or indeed increased the obligations on them. And I think all the evidence that we saw was that for a commercial broadcaster of its kind, which is the mainstream, popular, big audience kind, that was getting tougher and tougher and tougher, and therefore finding modifications, revisions, which gave us more confidence that it would still be attractive both for ITV, its shareholders, whoever they're going to be, and us and everybody else, for it to be still contributing healthily as a public service broadcaster. I think that was, that's what we were trying to to manage. And I don't think we did a bad job of that. I mean, it's easy with hindsight. You could say we were a bit. You could say we should have been tougher with them, but I think there's plenty of people on the ITV side who would say that we didn't give them enough slack, and they could have done X, Y, and Z a lot faster earlier if we'd given them a lot more slack. So it's a pretty fine judgment. I don't think we were miles away. I think it's very reasonable to say there was a substantial body of evidence that they were under considerable pressure on a secular basis, and therefore you had to adapt the approach. I mean, you could say the same thing. Just extend the point about the BBC. I mean, one of the things. We did have a relationship with the BBC when I was running Ofcom through market impact work, and that's another example where people in the BBC thought this was. Many people in the BBC, not all of them, but many thought this was pretty outrageous, intrusive, inappropriate, and so on. But when the BBC was set up, there weren't any commercial broadcasters, and then there were only 3, and so on. So the notion that through time you've just got to adapt these things, and a very powerful organisation like the BBC, got to be mindful of its impact on the market when there is a flourishing market that's trying to invest and be able to invest with some degree of certainty and predictability. I think that was a reasonable thing to do. These things, both of those, are examples of judgments that were not. You have to make the best possible judgment you can, and you're trying to sustain what you believe is positive and healthy in a way which is consistent with the sticking to good principles.
I'm going to come on to Ofcom itself. So, as I said at the outset, apologies if you can hear my dog barking in the background. Said at the outset, one of the architects that kind of put Ofcom back in place as part of the Comms Act. Looking at its remit over time and the way that its remit has grown, I guess 2 questions. Firstly, is it still fit for purpose, and how has that unfolded over time? Intrigued in your view as to the degree that having telcos and media under one roof has turned out to be the right thing, and the degree to which actually any of that work has significantly overlapped, or are they 2 separate pools of people thinking about 2 separate pools of issues?
Yeah.
And actually, respond to that, and I've got another one in a second.
Well, so you've got to think about this in different perspectives. So the first, I think. The question, was it sensible to think about media and telco together in the way that we did? I mean, I think the answer to that is unequivocally yes. I mean, I think that was clearly right. I think you then got to move to the new question, which is post-media and telco, of which there are 2. One is actually you are in a kind of post-media telco world to some degree, where they almost all, there's very few telcos now that don't have some content proposition, and there are no media companies who don't have to have a sophisticated distribution strategy, which may or may not involve different relationships with network infrastructure. So I think, you just think about the bundles of services. What do people buy? Well, they buy bundles which might include the whole lot: mobile, fixed, premium movies, premium sport, and access to, and a TV box. So I think that was absolutely right. But where you're at now is you're really not thinking media telco. You're thinking content and infrastructure, content and networks. So the question now is it sensible to have the same, the regulator doing content and networks as opposed to media and telco, if you see what I mean? And the next question, of course, beyond that, which is really the cutting edge one, is tech. And what do we mean by tech regulation, and how does that fit with all of that? And some of the aspects of the issues raised by the the rise of the global tech companies. Some of them are content in nature, some of them are economic network type in content, but of course they're not really network because they're all over-the-top software platforms, and they're a completely different kind of economic, or not completely different, but a different economic question. So they're not really infrastructure, or if you think about them in infrastructure, they're a different kind of infrastructure. You could argue that certain social media platforms or platforms of some kind are, you could make that argument. So I think it's a new set of questions, and that is the nature of the set of questions today. And is Ofcom? What was your question, John? Is Ofcom fit for purpose in relation to those challenges?
Well, as the industry shifts again, does Ofcom's remit need to shift with it?
Oh, well, I think Ofcom's remit has to shift in the sense, and I think that's true of any. I mean, there should be a thoughtful review of the remit of all major regulators. Certainly every decade at the absolute minimum, and Ofcom is a major regulator. So that absolutely should happen. And it needs to adapt to where the industry is and where it's going. And obviously, it's got various new duties. It's likely to get more. That presents all sorts of questions. It presents questions about the skills inside the organisation, the expertise, which obviously is skewed, begins to lean in new and or different directions. You probably get a question at some point about, you get two questions as well, one of which is scale and scope. And I think you've always got to be mindful about the bandwidth and capacity of the leadership of organizations like this, just in terms of how much there is on the tray to deal with. And you've got to be confident that you can do that. And then the second issue, which is related, is whether you can effectively interact with industry, with industries that are looking in very different directions. Some quite historic, with particularly very conventional regulatory models, and others, you're in really very, very new territory where people are still exploring what it means. I mean, so people keep asking me, are we nearly there on the regulation of tech? They use that obviously as a shorthand for all the things being discussed, and usually they mean the online safety bill and all of those issues. And my usual response is that you're going to have to get used to the fact we're probably in the foothills of this. I mean, I think it will take years to work out how you approach this in a way which strikes the right balances, which protects citizens, protects consumers, gives them the kind of rights they need, but doesn't deter investment, doesn't deter innovation, isn't too intrusive and costly. These are the balances you've got to strike, and I think it will take quite a while to perfect these. And people who are expecting a couple of years and we'll be done and that's it, I think that will be quite mistaken. I mean, even something which in hindsight looks so straightforward as telco regulation, took years. 20 years to work out roughly where we thought the right balance was between different types of regulation, different principles-based, rules-based. This is quite complicated stuff, and there's some fine balances to be struck. And as I say, I think we're probably in the foothills of it. So good for those who are interested in these subjects. But anyone who wants a quick fix, I think you're going to be disappointed.
I've told this story in the past. I think there was a book that Danny Boyle drew heavily from for the opening of the Olympics opening ceremony. It's a book called Pandemonium, which is a selection of contemporary accounts of the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. And people just being bewildered. I mean, seeing all these amazing benefits and all the rest of it, but a whole bunch of social and economic harm as well, and disruption, and not quite knowing how to make it. And it took the Victorians quite a long time to get on top of that and make sense of it. And
it did. It did.
There is a ways to go.
It's a very good analogy, and I remember thinking, just to illustrate this from my time back at Ofcom. I mean, one of the things I did in my last year or two, I remember I made a couple of speeches or contribution of some sort. I can't remember what they were really, but I basically the thrust of what I was saying was, look, this internet thing. It's in everybody's living rooms, bedrooms. It's everywhere, and it's merely a matter. Someone's got to start thinking about what the optimal approach to regulation or voluntary regulation or whatever you want to think about it is. And honestly, I couldn't get any takers at all. I mean, as if I was talking to a brick wall. And then, lo and behold, that doesn't award. I'm not trying to award myself particular foresight because I wasn't alone in saying it, but it was clear to people who'd been involved in the depth of these policy debates, and in particular in relation to the rising impact of these services, that you could think, well, there's only, they're going to be so powerful and so ubiquitous and so important that, that it is absolutely inevitable that there will be questions of concern to the policy-making political classes in response to the general public, and it did take a bit longer than I expected.
It always depends which end of the telescope you look down in terms of short-term versus long-term. Looking back at your tenure, particularly at Ofcom, it wasn't that long ago, but equally, there are still things in your speeches around. We believe that mobile is going to be quite big. Wireless routers are appearing in people's homes. This looked like a trend.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago, and I can remember furious debates about Wi-Fi, and I remember a huge debate about were we really going to make more capacity available for Wi-Fi? What would it be needed for? This is ridiculous, and so on. We could use our else. And look at that. Look at it now. I mean, everybody's house is full of Wi-Fi.
Exactly.
So no, and I agree. It has moved. In some ways, it's moved more slowly than I expected, and in other ways, it's obviously moved incredibly fast. And you're right. It's not that long ago that I was leading Ofcom. So it does depend what perspective you're taking.
Appreciate that Ofcom's remit has shifted a bit since you left in terms of particularly BBC regulation, but I'm sure some of these issues will still affect you at the time. How comfortable was it dealing with broadcasters who need to hold politicians to account? Given that your arm's length essentially between the industry and the politicians, there's an inbuilt incentive there to keep a low profile.
Yes, I mean, this is one of the subtle areas of sort of subtle balance in the system, which depends both on the architecture, but also on the approach of key people to try to make it work. So that is the different. That you need. That's what I mean by that is that you need, for these things to work well, you need both the formal aspect to be good, and then you need the informal reality to be respected and work well as well. And you always need both. I think formally, of course, the position is government. There is government. There is an independent regulator in Ofcom, and then there are broadcast organisations who are regulated who are themselves independent, ranging from BBC through Channel 4 and so on. So the formal architecture is sort of relatively clear. What it requires, though, on top is the judicious and respectful approach to that by the people in the most senior positions. I mean, I think it's really important that people at the top of those organisations believe that model and respect it and conduct themselves in a way that is consistent with what matters there. And what matters is that it is incredibly important that broadcast organisations and editorial leaders and editorial functions are not prone to or vulnerable to political pressure and manipulation. So your role at Ofcom is a very, very, very important one, as both actually being the regulator in relation to some of these content issues that are editorial issues that are incredibly sensitive, but also as a bulwark against anything inappropriate. Now, it is worth me saying that I would say, I think I worked with about 8 different secretaries of state during my sort of 8.5 years as chief exec, something like that, or it may have been a bit before. I would say that the vast majority did understand that and respected it, and again did approached it very sensibly. Partly because, of course, the wiser ones worked out that the last thing they wanted was to actually get involved in it, and having a regulator there to deal with it and be seen to deal with it and be seen to deal with it independently, objectively, that actually was the best answer for everybody. Now, there's no guarantee that in all cases, all future holders of those positions will take that approach. And you look at some other countries, and you can see where the formal architecture may well be in place, but the informal reality is completely different. And there is political manipulation and control behind the scenes, usually covertly, but sometimes almost overtly. And so it's you need all of those things to be in place. And my experience of it was by and large pretty darn positive, actually, I'd say. But I think it's a constant, it requires constant vigilance.
Simon Albury has written fairly recently about more recent Ofcom work. And he described Ofcom as being a general hospital that's great at geriatric care but doesn't have enough midwives to birth anything new. And so there was an interesting take. And the reason I bring that up is that also one of the things that happened on your watch is a consistent set of PSB reviews that essentially said similar things around the challenges to the core model of PSB. At some point that falls apart and we need to reinvent it. And in 2 specific instances, you then went further to put 2 ideas on the table that said independent regional news consortia, if we separately funded them, we can recreate. It's important for plurality and to have a different set of voices alongside the BBC and regional news and journalism and so on. But that will take funding. And similarly on the PSP, the public service publisher idea, broadcasters don't seem to be embracing things that aren't television programs as quickly as the market is. Yeah. And if there is public purpose and value in doing that, maybe the stimulus that's required is a separate institution to doing that. I guess the question that follows from that is, given the system needs to evolve now, where are you on trying to get the existing institutions to evolve versus creating new interventions and potentially contestable or dedicated funding that's part of that? And who's best placed to start to stimulate that, given the experience that you had?
Okay, well, that's incredibly interesting. So let's just recap on the 2 notions first. So the first point, in both cases, just let's make clear, we were seeking to sort of innovate and put things on the table to sort of drive thinking, and we can come back to them specifically. But let's just take the 2 points.
Just to jump in, were they specific proposals or were they stalking horses?
I would say they were a mixture of the 2. They were certainly designed in both cases to force the debate. And if you don't put anything on the table and you just throw your arms up in the air and say, "Oh, isn't it awful? Isn't it? Oh gosh, whoa!" Nobody listens. You literally can't get any traction. So they were definitely intended to put something on the table in order to force a discussion. Now, you can. That is my way of answering that. So you could call them stalking horses, you could call them policy proposals. They were sort of both, really. The trouble is, I've had too much experience of people saying, "Look, here's a report that says it's all looking a bit. There's many things to be concerned about."
Yes.
You write that and nobody
it's
bats an
stumbling on.
eyelid.
It's stumbling on, but it hasn't fallen over yet.
Yeah, there's nothing to respond to. So unambiguously, John, they were absolutely intended to force a discussion, and they certainly did that. But let's look at them, right? So firstly, I personally think that the hollowing out of local and regional news across the newspaper industry and the broadcasting industry remains a matter of considerable concern to me. And I think the role and the importance of a healthy, independent media in and holding to account and scrutinising political and administrative decision making is incredibly important. It's still very healthy at London, Westminster level. I think as soon as you go beyond London and Westminster and beyond the national media, I think it's pretty severely curtailed. And I go back to the era when you would have well-resourced local, regional, nations, newsrooms, alongside very well-resourced and highly active and effective newspapers. And I just don't see that anymore. And I think that has got a real consequence for the quality of accountability and scrutiny of political process and administrative decision-making in those areas. So I don't know whether that was the right answer, but I'm absolutely sure we were onto the right issue. And the PSP, let's take this back to your mention earlier of public service broadcasting or public service media. Look, let me just illustrate the point. I can't remember what year it was we talked about that, but let me tell you what I do now, and it'd be interesting to see what people react to. I am still a great consumer of all sorts of content, but I'm looking at my iPhone at the moment, which is next to my computer, and I basically listen to, for example, the BBC's radio services. I listen to most of them, and I listen to them all through BBC Sounds. I don't know. I don't think I turn the radio on as a linear broadcast function. I use a lot of them, but I use it all over the internet, on demand, at my own time of choosing, as chunks of content. It is, whether you like it or not, that is public service media. That's what it is. I actually do not use it in broadcast form. I suspect the same is true for many people in relation to the iPlayer, ITV Hub, 4 on demand, etc., etc. So, clearly, in terms of the evolution of services, what we were saying then, was right. And the question was whether people responded to it. Now, BBC Sound's a good example of how it has been responded to. And, I will be interested to see in the BBC's review of its services how many linear services survive and what they do with them. Because actually, what you are going to end up with is a public service content organization, and slightly less true where you're reaching peak time audiences for advertising, but the same sort of thing is true if you listen to what Alex Mann says about Channel 4. She rightly speaks about the success they've had in diversifying their revenue stream, and that is all about digital, non-linear, non-broadcast streams. So, again, on the issue, I'd absolutely defend what we were doing. Now, then you come to how did we manage to, can we stimulate a debate on that and get people thinking about it more aggressively and on a more long-term basis? Well, I hope we did that. But I think the evolution of where we've arrived at demonstrates on both points. One, I think regrettably, because of on the regional news, local news side, where we've got to, it's not great. And the other, perhaps, you can be much more optimistic about, because I think there's been a big material change towards what you would describe as, public service publishing, public service media, whatever you want to call it. That is where we're heading, and that's in some ways where we've moved dramatically to.
The PSP thing, I remember well. It led to all sorts of things, not least Channel 4's 4AP investment fund looking to invest beyond TV. So what does it mean to invest in a game or an app or a website or those sorts of things that has public service values to it? What it leads to is a debate around, well, are those institutions that are the traditionally regulated PSB institutions with those remits the right ones to try and wrestle with that? Because they haven't had a brilliant track record at it, and they're very focused on TV. And meanwhile, there are other people in the public sphere who are definitely creating content and services that have that sort of angle to them. Lessons learned or thoughts around how pros and cons essentially of contestable funding and who can divide that up, or is it better to get the institutions themselves to try and evolve and embrace this stuff?
Yeah, well, I don't think it's necessarily the right answer to it, but I don't think you could look at, the. I think ruling out the notion of, a pot of money that is contestable for these purposes, it's clearly a credible potential policy. I think you have to weigh it up against some people sort of said, it's ridiculous, could never work. I mean, I think that's ridiculous. Of course you could design something like that, and of course you could get it to work. I think that isn't the issue. I think the issue is it a preferable model to a more purely institutional version? And, that is worth debating. I think... generally speaking, I err more towards the institutional. It might surprise you to hear that, given the kinds of things we put on the table, but I do. And I err more towards an institutional model because I think there is value in institutional focus and purpose and clarity, and I just think these things can be quite complicated, and you want to try and any content, any significant content decision is complicated. It's a creative decision. You can't, it's not like producing, cans of Coke or something, or screwdrivers. These are complicated judgments, and therefore I think the institutional clarity and simplicity certainly has real merits. So my own personal instinct is I err in that direction. But look what's happened on what I was saying about the nation's regions and local news provision. I mean, we are not in a good place on that, and nobody. We've just drifted into that position. I'm not, at the moment, everybody just sort of shrugs and says, well, that's life. I mean, to be fair, there are some very interesting and exciting initiatives taking place around, ultra local news and community journalism and all of that. So it's not all bad at all. There's some very excellent people trying to do their best to sort of move those things forward. But, it's not as it was in the period when that world was, well resourced. So I that's where I would err, John, myself. But I think it's something well worth debating periodically, and it's really important that the institutions who are the dominant force in that area, feel that that's an alternative, such that they, really are on their mettle. As you say, and the picture over the period has been, it's not perfect. I mean, there's been some terrific stuff done, and there's been some great progress made, but it's not been. I don't think anybody would say it's been absolutely perfect.
Conscious of your time and whoever's listening to this as well, I'll just wrap up with two questions if I can. Opportunities that have been missed and lessons that we can learn from along the way. What could the industry collectively have done more to end up in a better place?
That is a difficult question. Look, if you were, I'm loath to criticise, to be honest, because it's hard. It's very easy to criticise about what should or should not have happened faster. All I would say about that is I think if you took the overall trajectory and in relation to sort of moving fast and effectively into the digital age, I think in many ways we've done some really outstanding things. Things move quickly, and in some other areas we probably should have moved a bit faster. But that is easy to say from here, and I make that observation in the sense that it's impossible for it to have been perfect. And I feel there's quite a vibrant feel at the moment to things, and I'd definitely rather look forward. I mean, there's no single direct answer to the question. Is there any single thing which I think is a sort of dramatic dropping of the ball or failure? I don't think so. It's about speed of adaptation is the real issue. I mean, you could point at something like the kangaroo decision, where there was the proposed joint venture. I think many people with hindsight would say that should have been permitted and would have created a stronger foundation stone to move more swiftly in that direction. I think that would be a reasonable observation. But otherwise, it's just about the pace of adaptation. And you can, as anyone who's run an organization knows, and I would put my own hand up to this, you can always, in hindsight, you can always move faster.
So last one, just to wrap up. There's a sense, I think, that with charter renewal coming up, we've had announcements from the Secretary of State around this being the last license fee settlement, and the license fee won't be repeated. Potential Channel 4 privatisation, new license agreements for ITV and 5, and a sense that whatever it is, by that stage, more than 20 years of Ofcom PSB reviews, which have essentially described the frog in boiling water, and the water's getting hotter, but it's not jumping out yet. Maybe the way to put it is if PSB or the industry was a current client of yours, what would you be advising them to do now to get ahead of the game? And as John Burt wrote in his memoirs, don't let things happen to you, but get ahead of the game and invent your own future. Well, so in terms of trying to get to the best possible outcome for viewers in particular, what should we be doing now?
Well, that is the right answer. You see, what John said there is right, and I would 100% endorse it. I mean, that is the challenge. I would just hope that all the leadership teams in all of these organisations sitting around saying, look, we've got to look after the day job, but we have to understand where we're going to be in line with our purposes and ambitions as an organisation, and how we're going to get there, and we have to make that future for ourselves. And when you get to the PSB entities, that necessarily involves engaging in public policy and regulatory issues as well as just commercial ones. So that is absolutely what they've got to do. They've got to accept that needs to be a debate with the government and the regulator, because it is, and indeed in many cases, in the end, it's a matter for the government. But the government is as much a taker of ideas as it is a creator of ideas. So you absolutely have to take initiative in these things and help create your own future. And if you don't, you just in a sense I think it's almost negligent not to be honest. If you're in the leadership team of these organisations, you've absolutely got to do that. So that is the central point, and I'm sure they're all doing it, but it is absolutely what they have to do.
Is it a big enough moment for another Peacock or Pilkington style review, independent of everybody?
Could be with the charter, because I think there is a sort of sense of, there is a sense that now is the time to ask whether the license fees as the central model as the cornerstone, is sustainable for another X decades. But so could be, because I think you've got to be confident about that, and there's no point putting your head in the sand and sort of saying let's not debate it. You should debate it, and if you think it's the right answer, you should have confidence about it and get on with it. So there's no point in putting yourself, I really don't believe in putting yourself in weak defensive intellectual positions. If we still believe that the license fee should be the cornerstone of a system like this, and a system like this should prevail into the future for very good reasons, then we should know why that is, and we should be able to articulate that case.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thoughtful and erudite as ever. We will look forward to this unfolding, and we are all in the foothills of this. But the next few years seem pretty pivotal. So thank you again for your time.
Pleasure. Thanks very much, John. Cheers.
Take care. Thank you. So we've now heard two different versions of what public service broadcasting should be. Lord Putnam's all-encompassing vision of a national health service of the mind, and John Whittingdale's narrower focus on providing a limited range of content that the market won't provide. We've now got two different ideas of the role of the regulator. Ofcom has long been regarded as an expert in analysing and assessing, but under Ed's leadership, it stepped forward and proposed solutions to the problems it had identified, stimulating debate in a sector that in Ofcom's view didn't seem to be moving fast enough. It will be very interesting to see which of these models Lord Grade and Dame Melanie Dawes adopts in the run-up to the renewal of the various licences and charters as the sector gets reshaped over the next few years. In the next episode of Lens, we change tack a little and hear from two industry veterans who were also my predecessors as chair at the British Screen Forum. Adam Singer was CEO of Flextech and a senior executive at TCI, and was one of the pioneers of the cable TV industry before becoming deputy chair of the Ofcom Content Board. And David Elstein has been a constructive critic of both public service broadcasters and Ofcom, and had a distinguished career as a producer before becoming head of programming at Sky and launch CEO at Channel 5. Don't forget to subscribe to have this next episode delivered as soon as it's released, and thank you for listening.